One of the most simple yet profound things Jesus said during his ministry was this: do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Have you found that to be true? Jesus talked about trouble again in another passage. He said this: in this world you will have trouble, but take courage, I have overcome the world. Now, I think that even the most ardent atheist would know that it's simply a given that this world has trouble. I mean, life has a bunch of trouble in it, doesn't it? But you know, this life that we experience gives us good times too. Life isn't always just trouble. Although, if life has given you a lot of trouble, you might not feel like there's any good times around. But there are. There are those times in life when there's peace and there's contentment, there's blessing, especially if you know the Lord. And the Israelites in ancient days, in Moses' day, experienced a time like that, a time of peace, a time of contentment after a pretty rough patch in the Sinai desert. They had been slaves in Egypt until God defeated Egypt on their behalf, and now they were walking through the Sinai desert to the land that God had promised their patriarch Abraham, but they weren't quite there yet. First, they needed to attend a meeting. They were meeting God. And as you might guess, the place that they were meeting God is a place called Mount Sinai, and Mount Sinai would be pretty close to the Sinai desert, for they were just traveling through. And so we pick up the story of Israel and their time of trouble and finally coming to a place of contentment, at least temporarily, in Exodus chapter 18, verse 1. And we read, "Now Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, how Yahweh had brought Israel out of Egypt." Now, it's been a little bit of time since we came across Jethro. Here's the backstory. When Moses was about 40 years old, he was living the high life as a Hebrew who was miraculously raised in Pharaoh's household. But then one day, he saw an Egyptian man beat up an Israelite or Hebrew slave, one of his fellow kinsmen. And so what did he do? He killed that Egyptian. And then, knowing that he was in quite a bit of trouble, he ran away, and he ran all the way from Egypt to Midian, which is in modern-day western Saudi Arabia. And that is where Moses met Zipporah and her 6 sisters. And Moses, once he met her, he ran off some mean old shepherds that were afflicting them, and Moses himself, gave water to Zipporah and her sisters and their flocks. Well, Zipporah and her sisters went back home, and they told their daddy Jethro, the priest of Midian. And they said, "Daddy, we went to water the flocks, and these mean old shepherds tried to shoo us away. But guess what? We met this wonderful Egyptian man, and he ran them off, and then he himself drew up all the water, and he watered all of our flocks himself." And Jethro said, "Well, where is this hero of yours?" And she said, "Well, Daddy, we just left him standing there." And he said, "Dad, blang it, how am I supposed to find husbands for you 7 girls? Out here in the middle of the desert, a little help would be nice. Go back and fetch them and bring them home for dinner." Well, one thing led to another, and Moses and Zipporah got hitched. About 4 decades later, God had a job for Moses. The job was, go get my people out of Egypt and bring them to this mountain, to the mountain that we call Sinai, and there I will meet with them and they will worship me. Well, for one reason or another, we're not exactly told why, Zipporah and their boys, Moses and Zipporah's boys, didn't make the trip back to Egypt. They went back home to Midian, to western Saudi Arabia, to the east of the Gulf of Aqaba, and they lived with her daddy, Jethro. But then one day, Jethro got the news. Moses and all the sons of Israel had made it out of Egypt, and they were camped fairly close by. And so Jethro decides it's time to make a visit. And so he brings along his daughter Zipporah, Moses' wife, and he brings along his two grandsons from Moses and Zipporah. And they come along and they catch up. And we read in verses 2 to 4, and Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Moses' wife Zipporah after he had sent her away, and her two sons, one of whom was named Gershom, for Moses said, I have been a sojourner. That's what Gershom means. I've been a sojourner in a foreign land, so that's why he named his first child. And the other boy was named Eleazar, for Moses said, the God of my father was my help. And that's what Eleazar means. God is my help. So he named the second boy Eleazar because the God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. Back when Moses had killed the Egyptian man and ran away, Moses gave credit to the Lord. Have you ever noticed, by the way, how thoughtful the people in the Bible tended to be when they named their kids? I mean, oftentimes the Bible tells us a reason for the naming of the child this or that, and many times those reasons have to do with God Himself. Not so today. Today you hear people just name their kids after something because they like the way it sounds. You know, what's your son's name? Oh, bibbidi bobbidi boo. Why'd you name him that? I don't know. But people in ancient days usually had a reason for naming their children certain things. And for Moses, he was well aware that the Lord had rescued him as a stranger in a foreign land by bringing him to Jethro and to Jethro's family. And he had realized that God had helped him escape the sword of the Pharaoh. And so this is what he named the two boys. And then we read in verse 5, then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife to Moses in the wilderness where he was camped at the Mount of God. Okay, this is the third time in 5 verses that we've been told that Jethro is Moses' father-in-law. I mean, you sort of get the picture. Verse 1, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law. Verse 2, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law. Verse 5, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law. We get the idea, don't we? I mean, what's the deal? Why is this so prominent? Why does it keep popping up that Jethro is Moses' father-in-law? Well, it's not exactly explicitly said in the text, but it seems to be that one problem that Moses has been experiencing in leading the sons of Israel is that they haven't had the same experiences. I mean, Moses was an exception to the rule in every sense of the word. Moses hadn't been a slave for the last 80 years of his life, but they had. And for the last 4 decades of Moses' life, Moses had been living with these foreigners. In the first 4 decades of Moses' life, he had been living with the king in the palace. And so now, you expect us to follow you, Moses? Are you really one of us? And they must have been saying, well, look who's showing up now. Moses' foreign wife, his foreign kids, and his foreign daddy-in-law. Moses even named his kids after experiences that none of us ever had. And so they must be wondering, is this guy Jethro, is this foreigner who obviously has some influence over Moses, because he is in fact his father-in-law, is this guy Jethro going to try to steer us away from God, from the God of our fathers, of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob? That's a fair question. And I think this passage answers that question. Let's find out. And I want you to notice in verse 5 where exactly it says that Jethro and Moses encountered one another again. It was at the same mountain where Moses had met Yahweh. Moses had met Yahweh when Yahweh appeared in the burning bush. You remember that incident in Exodus chapter 3, and God had told Moses, take off your sandals, for you're standing on holy ground. And the Lord, Yahweh, told Moses, that he would be the one who would lead the sons of Israel out of slavery in Egypt. And he would bring them to the land that Yahweh, the Lord, had promised Abraham, his ancestor, his patriarch. And here's what we read in Exodus chapter 3, verses 11 and 12. But, when Moses was told this, but Moses said to God, who am I, that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? And the Lord said, certainly I will be with you, and this shall be the sign to you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God at this mountain. Well, now where are they? He has the whole nation behind him, and they are right at the foot of that same mountain. And in soon enough time, Yahweh will show up in a very powerful way to the sons of Israel. In verse 6, we continue with the story. He sent word to Moses. Before they ever met, Jethro sends word ahead. I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons with her. Moses gets the word. He runs out to meet them before they ever get there. It says in verse 7, then Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, and he bowed down and kissed him, which is the proper respect shown to all fathers-in-law. He bowed down and he kissed him, and they asked each other of their welfare. And they went into his tent. Verse 8, and Moses recounted to his father-in-law all that Yahweh had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardship that had befallen them on the journey, and how Yahweh had delivered them. I want you to notice something. Moses recognizes that it was not Moses, but it was Yahweh who was the one who defeated Pharaoh in Egypt. Moses didn't do it. Israel, by their strength, didn't do it. They were weak slaves. It was the Lord himself who did it. And I'd ask you a question. Who do you give credit for the success in your life? As a believer in the Lord, do you have the tendency to take credit yourself for your position in life, for your salary, for your welfare, for your house, your nice car, whatever it is you might have, for whatever position you have, and whether it's fame or respect in the community or whatever else? Do you tend to receive glory for yourself, or do you give glory to the Lord? Moses properly gave glory to the Lord. And Moses says that Yahweh, the Lord, did all this for Israel's sake. And I'd ask you another simple question. What has God done for your sake? What has God done simply because God is good? Simply because God loves you? Do you recognize that? What God has done. Sometimes it's a big, miraculous thing. Sometimes it's a very simple thing. It could be family, children, grandchildren. It could be friends. It could be provision. The simple things in life. But God has done these things for your sake. Moses doesn't shy away from admitting that about the hardships that had befallen them. He doesn't shy away from that. He doesn't pretend with Jethro, oh, it's just all been fantastic. The whole journey's been smooth sailing. Moses doesn't say that. He gives an honest account of his journey, the good and the bad. And I would just say, it does no good when we Christians try to act like life is all kittens and roses when you become a Christian, because it's not that way. It's not real. If you give people the impression that their life will be perfect if they would only follow Christ, you're selling them a make-believe fantasy that will not hold up to reality. This life is sometimes hard, whether you're a believer in Jesus Christ or not. The rain falls on the just and the unjust alike. And one of the key differences in this life for us who are believers is this. If you're a true follower of Christ, God is with you always, even when this life stinks, when this life is tough, when this life makes you cry or makes you angry. If you're a believer, the Lord is still with you. That is a key difference between those of us who know Christ and those who don't. They don't have the Lord with them, not in that way. Not in the way that we do, where we can go to the Lord and cry out to Him and ask Him for assistance, knowing that He loves us. And like Moses and the sons of Israel experienced, they know this by experience now. When the Lord is with you, the Lord can deliver you. I want you to remember that. When the Lord is with you, the Lord can deliver you. And so go to Him. So the point of this verse is simply this. Moses is witnessing of God's goodness to his father-in-law. He's sharing with his father-in-law a witness of the Lord. And you might be thinking, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense, because why was Moses witnessing to Jethro? Isn't Jethro the priest of Midian? Didn't Jethro already know about Yahweh, about the Lord? Isn't Jethro already a religious guy? And the answer is yes. Jethro is already a religious guy, but you got to remember something. Jethro was a Midianite. Midianites shared a common ancestor with the Israelites. It was Abraham. The Midianites were descendants from Abraham's second wife, Keturah. The Israelites were descendants from Abraham's first wife, the one we most famously know, Sarah. And the Lord made a covenant with Abraham and his descendants through his first wife, Sarah. Keturah likely was raised herself worshiping other gods. And it wouldn't be surprising for us if the Midianites who came from her, including Jethro, the priest of Midian, combined the worship of the one true God with the worship of other spiritual beings, or even gods that they simply imagined or made up. You see, it's not enough to simply know about Yahweh. It's not enough to simply know that the Lord exists. Because God Himself, the true God, the Most High God, Yahweh, the Lord, He will not share the throne of your heart with false gods. Either He is Lord over all, deserving sole possession of your life, or else you have created a synchronistic pantheon of gods, of which He is one of many. And that is not who the Lord is. The Lord is not one of many. He is one and unique. He is the only creator of all. And I would remind you who Jesus is. Jesus is Yahweh in the flesh. Jesus is the only one who lived a righteous life without sin. Jesus is the only one who died on the cross to cover your sins. Jesus is the only one who defeated death by rising from the grave. Jesus is the only one who ascended to heaven as Lord over all. And Jesus will not be reduced to a lesser status than that which he deserves. You may not treat Jesus as if he is somehow the same as Buddha or Muhammad or anyone else. He is not the same. Worshiping the Lord your God, worshiping Jesus, Yahweh in the flesh, means rejecting the authority of other gods and having a believing loyalty to him and to him alone. And so Moses is bringing a testimony to this man Jethro, the priest of Midian, who very well may have had the Lord on a shelf along with many other gods in his mind. And Moses is bringing a testimony of how Yahweh is above all. And this testimony of Yahweh is bringing Jethro to a point of decision. Verse 9, and Jethro rejoiced over all the goodness which Yahweh had done to Israel, that he had delivered them from the hand of the Egyptians. So Jethro said in verse 10, blessed be Yahweh who delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the hand of Pharaoh, and who delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that Yahweh is greater than all the gods, for in this matter they acted presumptuously against the people. Jethro's come to a new understanding. Yahweh is not simply one God among many. Yahweh is not just a part of the pantheon of gods. Yahweh, as the Hebrews would say, in one of their titles for God, he is the Most High God. Yahweh is completely unique. He alone is creator of all things, even lesser spiritual beings that exist. He alone is eternal. Every other thing is created, and every other thing has a particular point of beginning in time. But Yahweh has always existed. Yahweh alone is all-powerful. Every other spiritual being has limits to its authority and its power, but that's not true of the God of the universe. God himself has all power and all authority. And Jethro says, now I know that Yahweh is greater than all the gods, for in this matter they acted presumptuously against the people. Who acted presumptuously against the people? Jethro is not saying, by the way, that all of these Egyptian gods were simply figments of their imagination. All of those gods that Yahweh had defeated are simply completely unreal. He's not saying that. Jethro believes that Egypt's gods were real, spiritual entities, and that these real spiritual entities acted presumptuously against Yahweh's people. What does that mean? It means that Egypt's gods believed that they could do anything to Yahweh's people that they wanted to do without consequence. Egypt's gods thought that Yahweh wouldn't do anything about it. Egypt's gods thought that Yahweh did not love his people enough to defend them. So they acted presumptuously against Yahweh's people. But Egypt's gods were wrong, and Yahweh defeated them one by one. One plague after the next plague was an attack on the faith that the people had in their own gods to provide them everything that they wanted day by day. And Yahweh systematically destroyed the Egyptians' faith in their own gods. It reminds me in the history books in World War II when General Douglas MacArthur published in the Japanese press this picture of him standing next to the person that the Japanese people worshipped as a god, Emperor Hirohito. Never before in human history had the religious faith of so many millions of people been so simultaneously destroyed as when this photo was published. Why? Because if the little guy is our God, then who's the big guy? And they immediately abandoned all worship in their own emperor. This is similar to what the Lord did in Egypt. Every time Yahweh defeated an Egyptian god in those 10 plagues, the power of the people's faith in those gods was completely wiped out. And I would say, how dare any spiritual entity presume that our God is either incapable or unwilling to fight for his people. How dare any demon, how dare any principality, how dare any ruler, any king, any president, any legislator, any judge, or any created thing dare to believe and teach and act as if our God will not fight for us. He will. Nothing is able to separate you from the love of God which is in Christ Jesus, our Lord. Jethro's come to a new understanding. Yahweh is God over all. And so Jethro, we read in verse 12, then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and sacrifices for God. And Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law before God. Now let me just pause and say, many of you had traveled with us through our journey in the book of Genesis. And you might have remembered that we encountered a king/priest by the name of Melchizedek. Abraham, in that story, who was the patriarch of the sons of Israel, Abraham had just returned from a very dangerous journey. And Melchizedek, who was not a member of Abraham's biological family, Melchizedek received Abraham with a communal meal. Melchizedek prepared a meal for the entire community that Abraham had with him. And Melchizedek gave honor to God, saying, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And now we come to the book of Exodus. We encounter a leader/priest by the name of Jethro. Moses, the leader of the sons of Israel, had just returned from a very dangerous journey. And Jethro, who, by the way, was not a biological member of the sons of Israel, received, just like Melchizedek, received Moses with a communal feast. And Jethro gave honor to God in this way: "Blessed be Yahweh, who delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the hand of Pharaoh, and who delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians." And so Jethro is acting very much like Melchizedek did once before. And now Jethro is presiding over a sacrificial meal. Moses is not leading the ceremony, by the way, which is unusual. This is a break in what's happened so far. Moses is the leader. Moses is doing everything, or maybe with his brother Aaron. But now Moses' father-in-law, this foreigner, this stranger, this other person is leading this communal meal. And so Jethro took a burnt offering. A burnt offering is one that's completely burnt up. And Jethro took sacrifices. Sacrifices were partially burnt. And Jethro took these burnt offering and the sacrifice, and he ate a meal with them. And the purpose of the meal, the reason Jethro was in charge, was because Jethro was welcoming them who were standing on the edge of his land. He was welcoming them out of Egypt and into that area. And by welcoming the elders of Israel to eat with Moses and Aaron, Jethro was also affirming to them that this strange journey that they were on is a journey that God had led them on. God is leading them, and God will bless them on the way. And I believe that it is good for us at times to stop and to celebrate when the Lord has led you to a new chapter in life because we remember that wherever we go, God is leading us, and God will bless us on the way. In verses 13 and 14, we read, "Now it happened the next day that Moses sat to judge the people. And the people stood about Moses from morning until the evening. And Moses' father-in-law saw all that he was doing for the people. So he said, 'What is this thing you're doing for the people? Why do you alone sit as judge, and all the people stand about you from morning until evening?' And Moses said to his father-in-law, 'Because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a matter, it comes to me, and I judge between a man and his neighbor and make known the statutes of God and his laws.'" Well, that makes sense. I mean, the people need a leader, right? And a leader, a good leader, will point them to the ultimate leader, who is God himself. So it seems pretty good to Moses. But Jethro has some experience with regard to leadership that the rookie Moses doesn't have. Moses has not been a leader for very long. Think about it. Before this endeavor, for the last 4 decades, who has Moses led? Sheep. And now he's in charge of a nation? He's in charge of a people? And he's leading these people into the desert? Does he know exactly where he's going? No, neither do they. And so Moses is doing the best he can. It makes sense that he would be the one to judge in all these matters that come before him. But Jethro, he knows a thing or two. He's a little bit older than Moses. And Jethro has spent all of his years as the priest of Midian, and in all likelihood, the priest of Midian also had some community responsibilities, some civic responsibilities in that area. And so Moses is going to receive from Jethro, this religious leader, some wisdom, because we all know that religious leaders have great wisdom, right? Verses 17 and 18. "And Moses' father-in-law said to him, 'The thing that you are doing is not good. You will surely wear out, both yourself and these people who are with you. For the task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone.'" Jethro saw something that Moses had failed to see. This was Israel's delegation system. And it's hard to see, but Moses' name is under everything. Moses was in charge of the water, the food. He was in charge of the judicial system. He was in charge of the legislative system. Moses was in charge of everything you could imagine. And Jethro says, "You're going to wear yourself out, son." And so verses 19 and 20, Jethro says, "Now listen to my voice, and I will give you counsel, and God be with you. You will be the people's representative before God, and you will bring the matters to God and then warn them about the statutes and the laws and make known to them the way in which they shall go and the work they shall do. But you shall select excellent men out of all the people, those who fear God, men of truth, those who hate greedy gain. And you shall place these men over them as leaders of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. And they will judge the people at all times. And it will be that every major matter they will bring to you, but every minor matter they themselves will judge. So it will be easier for you, and they will bear the burden with you." I want to point out the character of these men that were going to be delegated authority from Moses, who were going to be fellow judges with Moses. They were to be excellent men. There were to be those who fear God. There were to be men of truth. There would be those who hate greedy gain. And by the way, these 4 characteristics are incredibly good standards for us to determine judges in our day, whether they are spiritually qualified for the task. And I know not every judge in our nation is a Christian. There's no way to mandate that. And even if there was a way to mandate that, some people would simply lie about being a Christian. But I want you to look at this list and consider it. If a judge or a politician is not an excellent man, if we don't pick the best among us to represent us, then we're only hurting ourselves. If a judge or a politician does not fear God, it shows they have no respect for authority, and their decisions will reflect that. If a judge or a politician is not a man of truth, if they don't faithfully respond to God's truth, then they will be untrustworthy, they will be unreliable. If a judge or a politician does not hate greedy gain, then they will use their position to gain wealth for themselves. And then that means that they can be, and probably are, bought and paid for. And I pray that these crooks will be caught, that they will go to prison. We must have high standards for the people that are in charge of our lives to make decisions that influence and affect our lives. Jethro says in verse 23, if you do this thing and God so commands you, then you'll be able to endure, and all these people also will go to their place in peace. I love that Jethro, he qualifies this. He says, if you'll do this thing, but he says, if you'll do this thing and God so commands you. Jethro is yielding his recommendations to God's leadership in this matter. Verse 24, so Moses listened to the voice of his father-in-law and did all that he had said. And Moses chose excellent men out of all Israel and made them heads over the people, leaders of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. And they judged the people at all times. The difficult matters they would bring to Moses, but every minor matter they themselves would judge. Then Moses let his father-in-law depart, and he, Jethro, went his way into his own land. I would tell you that our lives today as believers in the Lord can be understood as a journey through the wilderness. There's a sense in which we will not arrive in the promised land until we leave the wilderness of this life. And it raises a very important question that I want us to consider. Does this life here and now offer us any rest? Is there any fulfillment at all in this life? And the answer is yes. There are times in this life, there are stops along the journey of this wilderness that we travel through, where we can pause and celebrate God. We can celebrate God's provision. We can celebrate God's care. We can celebrate God's mercies. We can celebrate God's love, even here in the midst of this wilderness we call this life. The Israelites had arrived at the mountain of God. This is a place where they would soon meet God. But the mountain of God that they were at that moment, that was not the promised land. It was an important step in the journey to the promised land. There are times in your life, as hard as this life is, where you can stop and meet with God, even though you haven't reached the promised land yet. We all have loved ones who have preceded us to the promised land. I would ask you, when you think of them, to recall the good times of God's blessings that they experienced before they arrived there. They had them in this life. Each of us as believers are on a journey to the promised land, and yet along the way, now, today, we can meet with God and we can celebrate His blessings. Waldemar Jansen wrote this: there are periods when we enjoy peace and have all we need, when all is well with our family, when God's promises have turned into concrete realities. Let us not miss them or devalue their reality because we know that the journey will go on. Let us pause, confess, and celebrate. I hope that this was something that you've been able to do in recent days at Thanksgiving. It's a beautiful holiday, a Christian holiday, really, a uniquely American holiday. But we can celebrate Thanksgiving really any time that we wish. So I would invite you to pause and celebrate what God has done in your life. If you don't yet know the Lord, know that Jesus died on that cross for you. He rose from the grave for you. He defeated death. He ascended to heaven for you. He's coming back again for you. And if you trust in Him and believe in Him, He will provide you salvation, and He'll always be with you.